This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Hello and welcome to the January 31st edition of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy podcast. I'm Brian Shrader, agronomist on the east side of the state, joined as always by my co-host and fellow agronomist Ben Jacob from Southern Indiana. Hello, Ben. How are you today?
Hi, Brian. I'm doing well. Western Indiana would work too. I mean, the southern half of it or central part of it. But yeah, Western's good. We can go with either way.
Okay, no problem. Well, I guess first thing to start off with, Ben, as we sit here today, certainly in my part of the world, a fair amount of rain. I know yours as well, probably making up for a little bit of subsoil moisture and things. I guess give me a weather report from your part of the world real quick before we get started with our discussion.
Yeah, you pretty well summed it up. Of course, we were out of town for a good part of it last week, which we'll get to. But yeah, it's been rain and fog as standard issue here for at least the past 10 days. Whenever the warm up happened, it switched. Right. Switched over to rain and fog. So that's what we're dealing with, but it's not a bad thing. That's
exactly right. Makes travel a little bit complicated. Certainly dealing with livestock and animals and things like that are a little bit more complicated because of the mud and the slug and all of that. But with that said, having the moisture is incredibly important. And so thankful for that. Hopefully it keeps coming and we get caught back up. I was really surprised how deep into the year we had gotten with the drought monitor. And so these rains are certainly coming along and hopefully will replenish some of the water that we need.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you mentioned that yourself and I were both out of town last week. We were attending the annual Pioneer Agronomy Conference in Johnston, Iowa at our seed headquarters out there. And so this is something that, at least for the time that I have been an employee at Pioneer, every year there's been an agronomy conference. Changed it a few years ago to in-person one year. On the off years, we went to a digital online agronomy conference, but I know that it's something that myself and you and our counterparts look forward to every year. So we had the opportunity to travel to Johnston in January. And those of you that haven't had the privilege of traveling to Iowa in January, I know that Ben and I would highly recommend that trip. That's just a joke. We always seem to hit a week where we have complicated weather when we go out there, Ben.
Well, I would say that, if you are planning your winter vacation to central Iowa, and coming from the east, just check the forecast, because yes, weather has been complicated, Brian, but I think every year I've been out there, we've been right after some sort of significant weather event, and the number of cars that have run off I-80 coming across Iowa it never ceases to amaze me. But I bet from the Quad Cities to Des Moines, there had to have been 150 cars, semis, everything off in the ditch. So when you plan your winter vacation to Iowa, which you should do, but whenever you're doing it, check the forecast first and adjust your plans as needed.
Yeah, and all joking aside, it is a wonderful opportunity for you and I and our colleagues to get together, share best practices, hear things, from folks in the organization, Corteva and Pioneer, but also to hear some speakers from universities and other places as well. And realistically, this year did not disappoint. And so I thought for the podcast, maybe we'd visit a little bit about a few of the takeaways that each of us had as we set through some of those discussions. Certainly some of those, because of it being who it is, are high level, and we won't be able to share full detail here on the podcast because we're looking into the future. But on the other hand, we also were able to listen to some speakers that have given us some things that we can bring back and talk openly with customers and growers in the field. And so, Ben, I'd be curious your thoughts maybe overall on the conference, and then we'll dig into maybe a couple of the speakers that you found most intriguing.
Yeah, Brian, you kind of mentioned that there are some high level things, some confidential things that we're not allowed to discuss. But as far as the value of being out there. The information is always good, on that. And this year it was as well. I think there are two things that I enjoy the most about doing this in person. And I don't know that we were clear about this. This is all the agronomists in North America, so the U.S. and Canada all together. And you know, managing a crop there are unique challenges year in and year out, and there are unique challenges depending on what your particular crop of choice and where you're at in the world. And it's really interesting to just interact with these folks from all over North America and hear about the challenges they're facing and how they're dealing with them, how they're developing their team professionally. And I feel like it just elevates all of us a degree, getting that networking opportunity and to hear about those things. The other part that I really enjoy is getting a high level overview. I'm going to say about our strategy for our corn and soybean portfolios in particular, and getting a chance to interact with those folks that are located in Johnston proper, that are making some of those decisions, and hearing how they think through that and how the competitive landscape comes together in their mind is always very interesting to me.
I would agree with that. I certainly find speaking with our colleagues, especially from the South, for some reason, I find those guys incredibly intriguing. We were joined by a group of folks, at least some, that I'd not met before. We added a number of folks to the organization who represent Phytogen, our cotton brand, and those folks also represent Pioneer in the South. And so getting to visit with those folks from the deep South who also are, selling cotton through the Phytogen brand, but also Pioneer corn. They've got a unique relationship with retailers down there. That's how we go to market in the South, is through retailers. And so talking with them just about their crop and about how they have they're getting pretty close to starting field work here in a couple weeks, a few of them. And so it was interesting to talk with them and get a perspective on corn growing in the deep South. And so I had a chance to visit with a couple of them on different occasions in some breakouts, and that was very interesting for me.
Yeah, I think I agree that it is interesting, and whenever I interact with those guys, I think, man, I have got a very simple life. I've spent some time in the Delta where you mix in cotton and you mix in rice and everything's furrow irrigated, and they're moving dirt every year to set that slope and all, and it's add in peanuts, whatever you want to add to that equation. But man, here in the corn, soybean, and a little bit of wheat world, it's pretty simple compared to what a lot of these guys are dealing with.
Yeah. No, and in a lot of cases, because of the fertility demand that cotton requires, they see some deficiencies and some things that you and I don't typically experience as well. And so, just a really interesting group of folks. And they're not the only ones. I mean, certainly, like you say, our colleagues from all over, you get to talk to the folks from out west that deal with irrigation every day. That's something that I don't have. I can certainly probably count the pivots in my geography on one hand, I'm guessing. And those guys go from farm to farm to farm and all center pivot, and they deal with, dryland corners and things like that. So that's always pretty fascinating conversation to have with those guys. I really enjoy getting to learn from all of them because, like you said, we can take some of those things that they learn or that they do on a regular basis, learn from those and try to incorporate them into some of the things that we do here locally.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that it just that interaction and just, that percolation of ideas across the group is really valuable. But
yep.
As we mentioned at the beginning, there's also some really good information in the presentations, some really good agronomic information and things that we're able to take back home as well. So, maybe on that front, we could highlight a couple of things that we each took away from Agronomy Conference 2024.
Absolutely. Both of my takeaways and highlights for the conference, probably my 1 and 2 presentations that I heard were actually around fertility and crop response to fertility. We had the opportunity to hear a gentleman who works for Pioneer, Dr. Matt Clover. And Dr. Clover spoke to us a little bit about the connection between corn biomass and fertility. And I found this very interesting for a couple reasons, Ben. Number one was some connections that Dr. Clover made between ratios of nutrients. Not necessarily a calcium magnesium ratio or anything that like this, but he pulled up and showed us some ratios that he has found in regard to a couple different nutrients. And then the other thing that he was also highlighting was in this particular study, Pioneer agronomists took plant samples, and we ran the plant samples through fertility analysis. We took one, I believe, at V5 or V6, and then did one at, I think it was just past VT, so just past tassel. And we looked at uptake on a number of these products or these nutrients. And one of the things that I found fascinating was that boron, specifically, and you and I have talked about this since this presentation, that most of our boron, 100% actually, is taken up before we get to tassel and planting. And that's a change that I need to get my head around, because I have been recommending to folks when they spray their fungicide application on corn to add in some boron. And based on this research, it suggests that we do not need to do that. We really should be doing that during side dress or prior to tassel. And so that was a big change for me. I found that fascinating. As I've thought through that more, it makes perfect sense, Ben, because of how boron functions in the plant. But I just kind of sat there and was stunned, because we'd been making those recommendations for so long. And so I found that really interesting, and something I'm going to start to put into practice a little bit more than what I have in the past.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you can call out in a big data set, and that's, you know, excuse me, that is it's sometimes you need a lot of input to really tease out some of those things and have confidence in where you're going with this. The other thing that was brought up in that presentation that I found kind of surprising, given my background, I guess, and this nutrient partitioning, nutrient uptake work kind of hits me in stride with some of the work that I've done in the past, was that this is actually the second time, and I guess part of it pulled into that data set, that on field scale sampling like this, we've shown that the nitrogen uptake that we've assumed to be true maybe isn't exactly
Yep.
what we thought it was.
Yeah, good call out.
Maybe the late season uptake demand isn't as significant as we've thought. There's a lot of data out there in the world that would show that that's close to 40% post tassel. For a couple of years, at least in the studies we've done, we're showing that to be a little less, which is something that I don't want to dive into it, because I've still got to wrap my head around it. I mean, it's kind of questioning a core tenet of nutrient uptake as I understand it, but I
Yep.
thought that was really interesting, coming out of Dr. Clover's study as well.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the ratios that I just want to highlight, and mention it, and I want to follow up just to be sure everybody understands. One of the ones that was really interesting is the nitrogen to sulfur ratio. Traditionally, that has been looked at, and realistically, one of the numbers that has come out based on this research, the data says someplace 10-1, and that's a little bit different than what the traditional view has been of that as well. And so this study has been pretty interesting, because you and we've just highlighted two things that I won't say it's put it on its ear necessarily, but it's starting to have folks perhaps question and look a little bit deeper into some of the long-term assumptions that we've made around plant nutrition.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that as we dig deeper into this, you and I both get a ton of questions, or I'm assuming that you do as well, around micronutrients and when and what to apply. And, we may or may not see a response from those in the crop, but if the more we understand how that uptake curve happens and when the crop actually needs them. I mean, your boron example is perfect for that. the better we can time those applications and improve the odds of seeing a response from them.
Yeah, for sure. So I'd be curious, Ben, other breakouts or other discussions that you found valuable?
Yeah, there were a lot of them. I'm going to go a little bit rogue and say that there were some discussions around biological products and Corteva's direction with their biological team. And the information was good. There's some nuggets that'll pull out. And if you attend any of my winter agronomy meetings, you'll probably see some of that. But what was interesting to me is kind of, you've seen, if you pay attention in the news, you've seen Corteva make some acquisitions over the past couple of years. And, we've had some products like Utrisha N out in the field and Utrisha P this year that we're looking at. It's interesting to see that biological strategy kind of coalesce. And I think research is one of our foundational strengths, good data quality and understanding what a product is and what it does when it makes it out to the field. So for me, as I look at the questions, just general management questions that have come in over the past several years, a good portion of those have been around biologicals. And a lot of the information out there is suspect at best. So I'm excited to see how this develops and having products that we know enough about to really make recommendations with and understand how to place them. But understanding what those are also helps us evaluate other products, right? Because we can draw parallels and we can see what actives are in there and maybe find some things out about how they're made. So it's a little bit more of a longer term play but there are some nuggets I'll use this winter. But that was one of the more well, it wasn't just one talk, but some of those were the more interesting talks for me.
I think that our customers who want to be into this space will appreciate the clarity and the ease with which I don't know if you want to call it usability of the direction that we're going, Ben. And that's probably about all we can say at the moment on this, but I think that folks will appreciate the simplicity of the approach that Corteva is going to take with our biological space. And but I agree, there was some really interesting learnings that came out of that, the large session that we had where they kind of started to lay the strategy out. One of the things that they talked about, which I found very interesting, was that at current time, there's somewhere around, I believe it was 1,200 different products that are in the marketplace that reported to be biological products. And you and I both know that it's incredibly complicated space, but to hear 1,200 different products was a fascinating number to me to try to figure out what is valuable of those 1,200.
Yeah, I think you're right with the 1,200 number, and the other one that stood out was I believe something like 430 or 470 different companies are making up those 1,200 products. So there's a lot of noise out there, and making sense of it it's an uphill battle. But I feel like this strategy that we have and the approach that Corteva is going to take to it, I feel like it's a step in the right direction. So
and is that. Yep, and we will certainly circle back around to that. I don't want to leave folks hanging on that, but I don't know that we're at liberty to share a lot of the details on that strategy yet. When they do, we'll be sure to get the appropriate folks onto the podcast so that we can lay out that strategy and discuss those products in a little bit more detail moving forward. Ben, I mentioned two when I started out. The second one is that Pioneer has funded a project with some researchers from K-State looking at infixation in soybeans. And we got a bit of a progress report, if you will, on some of that research. We all know that, or have thought for a long time, that nitrogen may be the linchpin in big soybean yields. This research would suggest that maybe that isn't quite the case, that there may be adequate levels of nitrogen available to be fixed in the soybean crop. The researchers that we heard from talked quite a bit about making sure that everything else is in line and working well. One of the key ones that we've talked about on soybeans is sulfur. That was mentioned at least in my breakout. But it was interesting that we have often thought that perhaps if we could figure out the timing on nitrogen, that maybe that's a silver bullet for 100 bushel soybeans. And actually, this research says that that may not actually be the case, that we may not need to supplement nitrogen. There may be some other things that we need to look at to ensure that we have good, solid nodulation and the rhizobium are healthy and can function well. And so I'd be curious if you set through that one and what your thoughts on that breakout session.
Yes, I did set through it, but Dr. Champiti had to step out, and
Okay.
one of his graduate assistants handled it. Still good information. I think one of the takeaways that was interesting to me is when they showed a map that had the portion of nitrogen uptake kind of distributed across the U.S. and how much of it came from fixation and how much of it came from soil nitrate. And what I recall from the map, and I'll have to review this in detail, was that as you went west, generally speaking, more of your nitrogen in the bean came from fixation. And as we went east, sometimes less than half of that came from fixation, which is counterintuitive to me because as organic matter increases as you go west, you would think there'd be more available for mineralization. So the long and the short of it, I think the big takeaway for me is we really need to take a more critical look about the environment that we are creating to allow that bacteria to colonize the root system and fix nitrogen. Um, you know, you can grow 100 bushel soybeans without any fixation if you're going to spoon feed it nitrogen throughout the season,
Right.
but obviously we don't want to be doing that, so we need to understand the system and how to, and I think optimizing that fixation is key, and not just that, but getting it started as early as we can in the plant's
Yep.
life.
Yep, for sure.
So
It just was interesting to me that, as we've talked about high yielding soybeans, most, myself included, have talked about, boy, are there ways that we can figure out how to add additional nitrogen, and when the timing of that has often been part of that conversation. And this research suggests that no, there's some other things we probably need to ensure are locked in before we go that direction. And so that was good. And some of the discussion after the presentation was valuable. Just again, talking to our colleagues that are experiencing some different things that were in my breakout session. And so those were the two that I really found valuable, certainly in many other nuggets from a lot of the others, but those are the two that I have found myself returning to as I've thought about the agronomy conference over the last 3 or 4 days since we've been back, Ben.
yeah, and I agree. I had the I mentioned the biologicals presentations, multiples, but I had the nutrient uptake in corn, the biomass sampling in corn flagged as one of my highlights as well. And we we didn't really touch on it, but one of the other takeaways in that is, and we've mentioned it before, just the amount of biomass increase in corn as yields increase. So you think about, we get hung up in tissue sampling about these concentration ranges, but when you're growing a larger corn yield, you're accumulating a lot more biomass above ground. So the tissue concentration could be the same in theory from say 150 to a 250 bushel corn crop, but the amount of mineral nutrient in that plant is going to be significantly more because there's just so much more biomass above ground. That would be the other takeaway from that stood out for me at first glance. But as you've mentioned, now that we're back home, we'll get some time to digest this, and we'll probably do a deeper dive on some of these topics as we move forward here. Brian, we'd probably be remiss if we didn't mention another significant effort from the agronomy team at Pioneer, and that's the Agronomy Research Summary book.
Very, very much so. I was going to mention certainly a a very large congratulation goes out to Ken O'Brien, who's head of the agronomy sciences group that put on the agronomy conference. Ken has a lot of experience within the organization. He's sat in those seats. He knows what it's like to be an agronomist. And so it's been very nice to have him kind of running things. And this was his first go round with an in-person conference. I thought he did a really good job. One of the individuals that was on the I guess the schedule was Mark Jeske. Mark is I guess you could call him the publisher of the Agronomy Research Guide. He certainly does the editor work and all those things. And this is a document that has started many years ago. I actually didn't even realize when he went through the history this year, Ben, how old the document actually was. It started in the mid 80s, it sounds like. And we've just continued to refine it. And this is a large book, in-house Pioneer research, literature reviews on important topics of note agronomically, that's published every year, distributed typically this time of year through our annual customer meetings in January, February, March. But this is a document that has a lot of information for folks, especially if you're one of those individuals that really wants to get into the minutia of the agronomy. This document or this book is really what that does. And so, I think there's probably several dozen articles that have been published this year in the document. These will be available for distribution or online, and we can probably provide a link or something in the show notes for folks. But if you attend a agronomy meeting this winter, there's a good chance there'll be a stack there for you to take as well. And so been a very important document for me as an agronomist to use with folks during the meetings and otherwise. And so, Ben, just I guess your thoughts on this particular publication, its importance, and even how you use it.
Yeah, you pretty well summed it up. I mean, it was interesting for us to hear the history of it, how it's evolved over time. It's a fairly high level read, and through it. But there as I scan through it, there is something in there in most years for everyone. It provides information, and you probably have to adapt that, take that to make your management decisions out of it. But I always find a few things in there that I'm going to hit in my little area of the world of winter meetings, that are 100% applicable to me. And then there's some things that, some emerging pests as they move around. There's some highlights from red crown rot, which is in the area. I haven't actually encountered it yet. I know it's around, and the same thing, like as tar spot was moving in, there's
Yep.
always good updates in that. So it's kind of to me, it's kind of a condensed version of letting me see basically what I experience and interacting with everybody at Agronomy Conference. I get to see
Yep.
agronomy from the 30,000-foot view, what's going on around the entire country. Can pull in information, and I know this is it's going to be touchy, depending on where you stand, and I don't want it to be that, but there's some great information around some of the shifts in weather that we've seen in recent years. And, even if you just consider the change of this winter going from a La Nina to an El Nino again,
Mm-hmm.
there's some good information for somebody like me, maybe not as much of a meteorologist enthusiast as yourself, to take away and, try and wrap my head around how that's going to impact management decisions we make as we go forward.
Yep. And, when you talked about biologicals, there's a nice article that talks about the microbiome in the biological and microbial section. You mentioned the weather and climate section. The soybean management section has a couple articles on, or I guess an article on soybean cyst nematode, an article on white mold management, two things that we've talked about on the podcast. For livestock producers, we've got some really interesting articles around plenish usage, and even a couple articles for the beef producer who doesn't always get lumped into those conversations when we think think about silage, it often is just dairy. If you're a guy that's interested in exploring new crops, there's an article that's been included on canola as well this year that's in there. And then we've always got, corn management, growth and development for corn, insect management for corn, and then actually a couple articles that will reference the biomass study that you and I spoke about from Agronomy Conference there as well are included in the soil fertility and corn nutrients section. So just a really wide swath of agronomic topics. As you mentioned, it'll be included, or some of those topics will be included in both your and I's winter meetings as we go around to customers. And so I would encourage somebody that wants to have this high level read and wants to really get into the nuts and bolts of some of these agronomic topics to pick up a copy of the Agronomy Research Guide so that they can read it and enjoy it.
Yep, very much so. So there's good information in there, and we will likely dive into some of these studies, and particularly as they tie into some of the presentations at Agronomy Conferences. As we move through the spring here before we actually get into the season, and talk about how they might inform some of the decisions that we need to make this year.
Yep. And that certainly, I think, will probably start in earnest for the next podcast. We just wanted to get everybody kind of caught back up on where we were at last week. We heard Ben's history with the company and how he got to where he was at last week. I know we've gotten some reports of some folks that both worked with Ben and I, and others who enjoyed that recording as well. And so we're back in the saddle here in 2024 and headed in to try to help provide some valuable information as we get closer to spring planting. So Ben, I think we'll kind of put a bow on this one here today. We always encourage our listeners to reach out to us if they want to reach out and give you some ideas or talk about maybe something in the Agronomy Research Summary. How can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, you can find me most active on the app formerly known as Twitter, at the Ben Jacob, and occasionally on Facebook at Ben Jacob Agronomy. How about you, Brad?
Yep. Best way to get a hold of me would be on Instagram at B_K_Shrader. And so with that, we'll call it an episode. We thank you for joining the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy Podcast.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.